The secret to strength after 50, just 1 minute of this isometric hold. Most of what men over 50 are told about diet and exercise was designed for a 30-year-old body. It's not wrong, exactly. It's outdated. Think about where the advice originally came from. Calorie counting, cardio-first training. These frameworks were built and popularized decades ago, largely tested on younger populations, then handed down as universal truth. Nobody updated the instructions when the body they were written for changed. The research on aging physiology has moved. There's a substantial and growing body of work on sarcopenia, anabolic resistance, and mitochondrial decline, all specific to the post-50 population. But the advice most men actually hear from gyms, from magazines, from well-meaning friends hasn't caught up to any of it. Today, we're going to walk through two pieces of standard guidance that quietly work against men in this decade of life, and the science explaining why a different approach performs better. No hype, no supplements to sell you, just the data and what to do with it. 5 points. Let's go through them. Point 1, the calorie deficit myth. Common advice, eat less, move more. Calorie counting. Cut your intake, create a deficit, lose the weight. This works for a while. And for a 30-year-old, it works reasonably well on its own. The researched reality, after 50, this advice has a blind spot, and it's a significant one. Men in this decade experience something researchers call anabolic resistance. It means the body becomes less responsive to the normal signals that build and preserve muscle, even when protein intake looks adequate on paper. Here's what that means practically. If a man in his 50s or 60s pursues a calorie deficit the same way he did at 30, just eating less across the board, a disproportionate share of what he loses isn't fat, it's muscle. That matters more than most diet plans acknowledge, because muscle isn't just about strength. It's metabolically active tissue. It's where glucose gets stored and processed. Lose muscle and you don't just get weaker, you become more insulin resistant, which makes fat loss harder, not easier. It's a feedback loop working against the exact goal the diet was meant to serve. So the deficit-only approach can technically move the number on the scale while quietly undermining the metabolic health that number was supposed to represent. Consider what this looks like in practice. A man cuts 500 calories a day, sees the scale drop 10 pounds over 2 months, and feels the plan is working. But body composition scans on similar cohorts have shown that a meaningful share of that loss, sometimes close to a quarter of it, can come from lean tissue rather than fat, particularly when protein intake and resistance stimulus aren't specifically prioritized during the deficit. The scale doesn't distinguish between the two. The mirror might not either at first, but the metabolic consequences show up later in blood sugar regulation, in recovery time, in how the body handles the next holiday season of eating. This isn't a reason to abandon calorie awareness. It's a reason to change what the deficit is built around, protecting muscle deliberately rather than assuming it will simply come along for the ride. Point 2, the cardio-first assumption. Common advice for heart health and longevity, prioritize cardio, running, cycling, steady-state work. It's the advice men have heard since their 20s, and it's not baseless. Cardiovascular exercise does support heart health at every age. The researched reality. After 50, cardio alone stops being the most efficient lever for long-term vitality because it doesn't address the tissue that's declining the fastest. Muscle mass declines by roughly 3 to 8% per decade after 30, and that rate accelerates after 50. This is called sarcopenia, and it's one of the strongest predictors of frailty, falls, and loss of independence in later life, arguably a stronger predictor than cardiovascular fitness alone. Cardio training doesn't meaningfully slow this decline. Resistance and isometric training does. There's also a second layer here worth understanding: mitochondrial density. Mitochondria are the energy-producing structures inside your cells, and their efficiency declines with age, which is part of why energy and stamina feel different at 55 than they did at 35. Resistance-based training, including isometric work, has been shown to improve mitochondrial function in aging muscle tissue in ways that steady-state cardio does not replicate to the same degree. It's not that cardio is wrong, it's that it's incomplete. And for men over 50, it's often prioritized in a way that leaves the bigger lever untouched. There's also the matter of bone density, which follows a similar pattern to muscle. Bone responds to mechanical load, to being asked to bear weight and resist force. Cardio, particularly low-impact cardio like cycling or swimming, provides relatively little of that stimulus. Resistance and isometric work provide substantially more, and bone density decline is directly tied to fracture risk, which is itself one of the leading causes of loss of independence in men over 65. Put simply, cardio protects the heart. Resistance and isometric training protect the heart, the muscle, and the skeletal frame that keeps a man upright and independent. For a longevity strategy, that's a wider net cast for roughly the same time investment. Point 3, the longevity science angle. Why isometric holds work differently at this life stage. So here's the piece that's genuinely different, and it's worth sitting with. An isometric hold is a static contraction. Think a wall sit, a plank, or a held squat position. No movement through a range of motion, just sustained tension. For decades, isometric training was treated as a secondary tool, something physical therapists used for injury recovery, not something serious about strength would center on. That view is being revised. Recent research on time under tension training has found that sustained isometric contractions activate a signaling pathway called mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is one of the primary triggers for muscle protein synthesis. Critically, this activation doesn't require the joint stress or the recovery burden that heavy dynamic lifting demands. That distinction matters enormously for men over 50. Because it's precisely the group most likely to be managing joint wear, past injuries, or reduced recovery capacity. The conventional advice, lift heavier more often, runs directly into the physical reality of this age group. It's advice built for a body with different recovery economics. A 1-minute isometric hold performed correctly produces meaningful muscular tension and metabolic demand without the joint loading of a heavy dynamic lift, and without the extended recovery window that kind of lift typically requires. This is the unique angle. At this life stage, the limiting factor usually isn't willpower or time. It's recoverable capacity. A man in his 20s can often train hard 4 or 5 days a week and simply out-recover the damage. A man in his 50s or 60s, with reduced hormonal support for repair and often a backlog of minor joint issues, doesn't have that same margin. Push too hard, too often, and the result isn't faster progress. It's inflammation, fatigue, and inconsistency, which undoes more than the training itself contributes. Isometric training works with that constraint instead of against it. Because there's no eccentric, no lengthening under load phase, which is the primary driver of the muscle damage that demands long recovery, isometric holds can often be performed more frequently than heavy dynamic training, while still delivering the tension needed to signal growth and strength retention. This is part of why a study group performing brief daily holds showed measurable strength and metabolic markers improving over a period of weeks, without the wear and tear patterns seen in higher impact protocols. It's not a shortcut. It's a better fitted tool for the biology of this decade, one that asks less recovery debt of a body that has less recovery capacity to spend. Point 4, reframing protein threshold, not total. There's a second layer to the anabolic resistance issue from point 1, and it directly informs how nutrition advice should shift. Common advice, again, hit your daily protein total. Whatever number, 100 grams, 120 grams, spread however it fits your day. The researched reality, total matters less than most men assume. Distribution matters more. Because of anabolic resistance, older adults require a higher per meal threshold of protein, generally cited around 30 to 40 grams in a single sitting, to meaningfully trigger muscle protein synthesis. Below that threshold, the body's response drops off sharply, regardless of how much protein gets eaten later in the day. This means a man eating a light breakfast, a modest lunch, and a large dinner may hit his daily total on paper while missing the threshold at 2 of his 3 meals, getting a fraction of the muscle-building benefit his intake should provide. Take a common real-world pattern: coffee and a piece of toast for breakfast, a quick sandwich at lunch, then a substantial dinner with meat, vegetables, and a side. That third meal might comfortably clear the threshold. The first 2, don't come close. On paper, the daily total might look reasonable. In practice, the body may only be getting 1 real opportunity that day to trigger muscle protein synthesis instead of 3. The researched approach is straightforward. Distribute protein evenly, aiming for that per meal threshold at each sitting, rather than treating the day as one large bucket to fill. That might mean eggs or a protein shake at breakfast instead of toast alone, a larger portion of chicken, fish, or legumes at lunch, and a moderated portion at dinner, so the day balances rather than backloads. It's a small shift in structure. The physiological difference it makes at this age is not small. Point 5. Bringing it together. What this actually looks like. 2 pieces of standard advice, calorie deficit only eating and cardio first exercise, aren't wrong for every stage of life. But applied without adjustment after 50, they work against the physiology that's actually changing. Anabolic resistance, accelerating muscle loss, and declining mitochondrial efficiency. The research alternative isn't more extreme. It's more precise. Short, sustained isometric holds as little as 1 minute that respect joint capacity while still triggering the muscle building signal. Protein distributed to meet a per meal threshold, not just a daily total. Training and eating built around the recovery economics of this decade, rather than the one 2 decades behind it. None of this requires more hours in a gym or a stricter diet than what most men already attempt. It requires redirecting the same effort toward the mechanisms that actually respond at this stage of life. That's the difference between advice that was never wrong, exactly, and advice that's finally correct for the body it's being given to. This isn't about reversing age. It's about understanding it accurately enough to work with it and staying strong on terms that actually fit where you are. So here's what the research actually shows. Calorie deficits and cardio alone aren't enough after 50. Anabolic resistance means muscle needs to be protected on purpose, not assumed. A 1-minute isometric hold paired with protein spread evenly across meals works with your body's recovery capacity instead of against it. That's not a shortcut. That's just accurate science for this stage of life. If this gives you something useful, subscribe to Primespan After 50 and turn on the notification bell for another research-backed video on longevity science, vitality for healthy living. I'll see you there.